The fever was a furnace in his bones, and for a long moment Daniel could not tell whether the ceiling was a sky full of clouds or the inside of his own skull. He clutched at his shirt as if it could hold him to the floor, and smelled oil, sweat, and something sharp and metallic from the toolbox by the doorway. He thought he would not see morning. The only person who moved without hesitation was the old cook everyone in the neighborhood had dismissed, the woman people called Agnes, the one Daniel had hired out of a sense of pity and a terrible practical need. If you are new here, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and we will keep sharing stories that remind us of what human hands can do. But to understand how a hand people ignored became the one that stopped a life from slipping away, we have to go back to the long quiet that built up around the farmhouse, to the days when laughter had left the rooms and the kettle whistled to empty chairs. Daniel was 48, a farmer who had once believed a man could hold an entire place together by himself. Since Mara died 3 years before, he moved through the mornings like a man wearing someone else's shoes, his steps heavy and exact, the house smelling of stale bread and old coffee. He kept the land because it was what remained of promises, because the fields seemed to answer when he called their names. But he slept alone and ate alone and kept a small iron box of his wife's letters on the top shelf of the closet like a relic he did not dare open. He was quiet, stubborn, and slow to ask for help, and his hands were calloused and steady in a way that disguised how tired he was at the heart. Daniel had a childhood that mattered to the way he would one day stand beside a sick bed. He had been the eldest of 5 children on a small plot where the soil was sandy and the winters bit at the hands. His mother taught him how to tie rope and read clouds, and his father taught him how to repair a fence without wasting twine. There were bread crusts and laughter, and then sudden absences when money ran out. A brother who left for the city and never sent a letter. He learned early that work could make the world seem less unruly, but it also taught him to hide things, to fold feelings into pockets and only take them out when absolutely necessary. He met Mara at a market under a blue tarp where she sold herbs and little jars of honey. They married quickly, had a small life that fit between the barn and the orchard, and for 10 years the house smelled of soup and the table was always set for 2. When Mara died in a hospital far from home after a short, sharp illness, Daniel did not cry for weeks. He kept her apron on a peg, and sometimes he opened the recipe book she had kept, running his thumb over stains of oil and ink, feeling as if the pages might contain a spell to bring back the laughter. The loss taught him endurance, and it taught him the old, quiet kind of loneliness that looks ordinary until you have to live inside it. The change that began to undo that solitude arrived on a day that smelled of dust and cut hay. It was a woman from the next lane, round-shouldered and wrapped in a threadbare shawl, who knocked and said she would like a trial week cooking for him. Her name was Agnes Barlow, 72 according to the faded paper she carried, and the town had learned to shrug at her. People said she was slow, that she remembered names poorly and broke dishes, that she should be put somewhere soft and out of sight. Daniel almost laughed at her asking, but the pantry was thin, and his hands no longer made a proper stew. He let her stay for a week to see. That first meeting had a handful of small conversations that stacked up like nervous stones. Agnes said, "I'm not much to look at, but I know the soil and the simmer." Daniel said, "I'm not used to company." And Agnes said, "Company is not a condition you have to sit with. It's a recipe you can learn." Her voice was small, like wind in old corn, and when she moved she left a scent of rosemary and lemon peel that lingered in the rafters. People in the lane watched and whispered. Tom, who ran the feed store, joked that Daniel would not last a week with someone slow rounding the corners. Lucia, the seamstress, shook her head in the market and told her daughter not to waste time on old promises. Javier, the mechanic down the road, bet a crate of potatoes that Agnes would be gone in 3 days. Rosa, who cleaned the church hall, brought a plate of cookies and said nothing, and Pastor Miguel blessed the stew and muttered prayers into his beard. Even Daniel's nephew Mateo, who came up on weekends to help with the cows, rolled his eyes and called it a house experiment. The early days felt like small revolution. Agnes did not move quickly, but she moved with intention, humming a tune Daniel did not recognize. She walked the kitchen like someone reintroducing herself to an old friend. She left a towel on the windowsill that smelled of lavender and dried citrus. When she cooked, she mashed flavors together like she was discovering the map of the house. A little more salt here, a squeeze of lemon there, an herb that felt like sunlight in the mouth. Conversation in that first week bloomed with more weight than Daniel expected. Agnes asked about a scar on Daniel's forearm. Daniel answered, the word slow, about a fence gone wrong when he was 22. Agnes told a story about losing a brother to the sea and how she had learned to mend nets and hearts. They traded small confidences the way people trade seeds, tentative and precious. Daniel found himself telling her about the recipe book in the closet. She opened it with trembling hands and said, "These are the bones of a life." The presence of Agnes changed the house one plate at a time and layer by layer. And for the first time in months, Daniel noticed how the kitchen light fell across the table and how the mug of coffee warmed his palms. As the new routine settled, a subtle tension began to move through the lane. Neighbors who preferred their assumptions unchallenged made remarks that smelled like old prejudice. Tom, the feed store man, muttered about the expense of having someone around, as if care should be measured by the price of flour. Lucia called Agnes clumsy in the market, where she ran scissors and gossip in equal measure. Javier, who fixed tractors and liked precise parts, said Daniel would be given to softening if he let someone else take the rhythm of the farm. There were public tests of Agnes's competence meant to shame her into leaving. At the Saturday market, someone dropped a jar and blamed her. At the church bake sale, a loaf went missing and fingers pointed. Pastor Miguel offered silent prayers but did not preach about the dignity of the ignored. On a bright morning, a group came to the farmhouse to ask for a meeting, and the scene unfolded like a town trial. The dialogue then was sharp and real. Tom said, "You cannot run a place like this on sentiment." Lucia said, "People are watching, Daniel. You must think of the harvest." Javier said, "We did not raise you to be soft." Agnes answered, "I've been cooking since I was small." Mateo said, "Uncle, let her stay." Rosa stood quiet, wiping her hands on her apron, and then she said, "Let the woman cook the bread." The exchange lasted long enough for birds to stop in the pear tree and watch. The community's opinion hung in the kitchen like dust. Agnes's hands trembled but did not stop kneading. Daniel felt the old instinct to fold and close, to let other people's rules decide his life. Instead, he said, "I'm the one who will eat the food." He signed the papers that kept her on with a cautious hand. That choice thinned some relationships and changed others. It also named a handful of people who would matter later when the farm needed more than bread. The months that followed were smaller miracles. Agnes taught Daniel how to slice onions without crying and how to make tea with lemon verbena so that sleep would come easier. It was never simple. Some mornings she would forget a step, drop a pan, talk to a pot as if it were an old friend. But she knew the land in a way that did not require the arrogance of youth. She kept a small jar of an herbal salve in her apron, a recipe she said came from her grandmother, and she rubbed it into sore shoulders and cracked heels. The barn took on a rhythm of clinking tools and low jokes. There were scenes that could have been ordinary and became tender. Daniel bringing in a crate of eggs, Agnes arranging them like little sons, Mateo asking for a taste, Rosa leaving an extra loaf at the gate. The house filled in little ways. A knitted blanket appeared over a broken chair. The recipe book moved from the top shelf into the kitchen, where it lived open like a kindly map. dialogue during these months was rich and repeated, a small chorus of practical kindness. Agnes said, "Try this today, Daniel." Daniel said, "It smells like your kitchen." Mateo said, "You're doing us proud." Rosa said, "Don't forget to rest." Lucia mumbled, "Well, it's working." Javier grunted and brought bolts and left space in his voice for a grudging respect. The lane softened, then hardened, then softened again, as neighbors saw food, kept people talking, and then people talking kept the farm alive. At about 35% of the story, I need to pause and ask you, if this is moving you, to breathe for a moment and share something small. If this story touches you, tell us in the comments if you have ever underestimated someone by age or appearance, and start your note with "I" so we can find you easily. Your words help others feel less alone, and they help keep these stories circulating. Now back to the day the accident changed everything. It was late summer and the field shimmered with heat. Daniel had been repairing an old feed cart alone. The metal teeth had rusted and the axle was sticky. He asked Agnes to stay at the house and keep an eye on the stew and on the kettle. She had been preparing a chamomile infusion and a jar of her salve for the night. The afternoon had the hollow sound of a small thunderstorm that never arrived. Daniel climbed onto the cart, testing the braces, and heard a twisting sound that did not belong. The scene fractured the slow pace of the farm into sharp details that would later live in memory like a string of nails. The cart tipped. Daniel felt the world ride away on a slanted plane. He heard a bone pop in the quiet that followed. The tractor's wheel clipped the edge of the furrow and began to slide down where the field sloped toward the ditch. The fall was cinematic and precise in the way accidents are, speed and wrong angles, and the thud of metal finding flesh. The smell of oil turned sick. When Daniel went under the wheel, he thought of Mara's voice and of the small things that had made his days. He had a moment of absolute clarity where survival seemed like the work of prayer and stubbornness combined. The rescue started with neighbors running as if they had only one thing left in them to give. Javier bolted across the field, his hands raw from a lifetime of engines and his face open with fear. Tom brought Strax from the feed store. Lucia ran with a blanket on her arm. Mateo jumped the fence with a shout, and Rosa kept her apron like a flag. Agnes was at the gate before anyone else, carrying her jar of salve and a rag. The dialogue in that first 10 minutes was the kind of conversation that carves people open and shows what they are made of. Javier said, "Get the wheel steady." Tom said, "Tie this rope to the axle." Mateo screamed, "Uncle, hold on." Agnes said, "Breathe with me, count with me," and she began to work in a way that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with steadiness. Her hands were calm and warm, and she talked to Daniel as if they were deep in the kitchen and he were injured by a fallen pot. She pressed the salve into his forehead and held a cloth to stop the bleeding. The neighbors improvised like a chorus of makeshift medics until the ambulance from the next town could get past a washed-out bridge. When the EMTs arrived, Dr. Elena, who had come from the city clinic, took one look and said, "The leg is compound and we have to move him now." The ride to the hospital was jagged and smelled of antiseptic and hay. Daniel kept hearing Agnes's voice counting out measures of tea and flour as if it were a metronome for his heartbeat. The first moment of peak tension lasted in memory like a long, close breath. The ambulance doors slammed. The bright hospital light was clinical and white and scalded the darkness out of the scene. The wound on Daniel's thigh was ragged and angry, bone visible where it should not be. Dr. Elena said, "We will have to operate immediately." There was a fear that the infection would claim more than a limb. Agnes stood near the door with mud on her apron and eyes that did not hide fear, but she did not move away. The next 500 words or so in that room were slow and precise. Surgeons prepared instruments like a ritual. Daniel, delirious with fever and pain and the steady drip of morphine, reached in the only place he could reach, for memory and for the smell of rosemary. He asked for Agnes, by name. She had been refused help by many in the town, but here she was, uninvited and unafraid, and she whispered to him the old recipes her grandmother had given her for drawing infection out of skin and for making a poultice that eased the first hours. The EMTs relayed the information. Dr. Elena listened with the careful attention of someone who has learned that practical remedies and formal care can be partners. The surgeons worked while Agnes described her salve and its preparation. The scene slowed into a kind of work that was both technical and domestic, the overlap of hospital and kitchen. After the operation, the next block of tension came when tests revealed that Daniel had contracted a stubborn infection and that the bone had been grazed. It was not only the physical injury to contend with. There was the possibility that his farm life, the thing that defined him and paid the bills, might be over. Neighbors gathered in hospital chairs like a town tribunal of worry. Javier said, "If the leg does not heal, what will he do with the fields?" Tom said, "We can replace a few hands." Mateo, young and fierce, said, "No one is taking the farm." Agnes said, "Let us move slowly, give his body what it needs." And the old woman who everyone dismissed spoke with a clarity that was almost like command. The medical team consulted. Dr. Elena admitted there were limits to what surgery and antibiotics could do, and that Daniel would need consistent care and a slow convalescence. The community, which had been quick to judge, now had to face a different question. Who would help with the daily, patient work of mending a man back to life? The answers were awkward and generous in equal measure. Recovery began as a patchwork of small kindnesses and stubborn routines. Agnes took a leave from town obligations and turned the farmhouse into a clinic of herbs and company. She changed dressings with hands that were as steady as a clock and brewed bone broth that smelled like the orchard in winter and tasted like the past. The dialogue of these days returned to the soft subjects that make recovery possible. Daniel said, "I did not think I could lie here and not feed the fields." Agnes said, "The land will sleep. It is people who need you to wake." Mateo said, "I will manage the morning rounds." Rosa came every evening with clean sheets and bread. Tom and Javier took turns bringing firewood. Pastor Miguel read psalms, but also got his hands in the compost heap. Daniel learned small mercies. He learned to accept the salve rubbed into his scarred skin without shame, and to listen when Agnes hummed to a pot as she cooked. He discovered that asking for help could be its own kind of courage. The long, slow days were punctuated by tiny triumphs like sitting at the table again, shaving with a shaky hand, stepping into the yard without a cane for a few steps. Conversation contained gratitude that was awkward and real. Daniel said, "Thank you," in a voice that sounded strange to him. Agnes said, "You had to let someone stay." Mateo said, "We did what family does." Rosa said, "You are not alone." Over the course of the third month, the farm began to look different in the small ways that add up to profound change. The recipe book returned to the open kitchen corner, and neighbors started to leave small things at the gate that said, "We saw you when you were invisible." Lucia mended an overcoat and hung it where the wind could find it. Javier fixed a squeal in the barn door. Tom sponsored a new set of straps for the feed cart. Dr. Elena visited and, seeing the steady care, recommended a physical therapist from the city who could come twice a week. The town's sentiment shifted from suspicion to a grudging respect and then to a softer pride. Daniel hired Agnes officially, and then, in a gesture that surprised everyone including himself, he asked her to record some of her grandmother's recipes into his wife's old book. Agnes laughed and said, "It will be heavier with stories." She wrote in a careful hand and added notes about salves and when to call a doctor and when to laugh. That gesture created a small legacy. The real test came when the insurance refused a part of the claim for the machinery damage and said the farm did not qualify for certain emergency subsidies. The possibility of losing equipment to pay debts loomed like a second injury. The community reaction was complicated. Some were ready to help with fundraisers, and some preferred that things remain business as usual. It was then that Agnes organized a bake sale and a harvest night at the church hall that Pastor Miguel agreed to host. Rosa brought pies, Lucia sewed tablecloths, Javier fixed the lights, Mateo ran errands. They raised enough to repair the cart and replace a pair of wheels. The act was small and concrete, and it changed the town's relationship with the idea of care. The moment of collective action taught Daniel that help could be arranged and that people could be more than the sum of their earlier judgments. 1 month after the accident, Daniel could stand in the yard and watch the calves move across the sunlit field. Agnes had rearranged the kitchen to accommodate his slower gait and placed a folded blanket over the chair by the window where Mara would have sat. She had placed the recipe book open to a page of lemon tarts and rubbed a new polish into the table. The scar on his thigh was a pale crescent, and he ran a hand over it with a new familiarity. He hired Rosa part-time for the mornings, and Javier continued to come by for a few hours each week. The house smelled of citrus and baking, and the neighbors had begun to stop by for a cup of broth and a story. 3 months later, the field was no longer Daniel's solitary domain. He had brought on 2 part-time helpers, Lucia's son in the mornings and Mateo on weekends. And he had written a note to the county asking about a community grant that might help buy a safer cart. The town church put an announcement in the bulletin. A small fund had been set up for people who needed a new start. 6 months later, the farm had a different sort of routine. Daniel, with a slow but steady stride, walked the rows accompanied by a group that included Mateo, Lucia's son, and 2 young people who had come for work experience and stayed because someone had once given them a chance. He had a scar he would always keep as a reminder, and a book of new recipes that included Agnes's salve and instructions for how to make a broth that would pull a fevers down. He had also done something concrete to shift the town's structure. He and Pastor Miguel had worked with the city clinic and Dr. Elena to set up monthly first aid workshops at the church hall, where small things like how to make a poultice or how to tend a wound were taught alongside how to call for formal help. The workshops were run by a group that included Tom, who had finally admitted he did not know everything about care, and Rosa, who baked for the participants and told stories while they practiced bandaging. Agnes was given a small certificate by the town and a seat at the harvest table, and people started telling newcomers the story of how a kitchen saved a farmer. There were practical changes too. Daniel signed the papers to formally employ Agnes and to create a small payroll for Mateo and the people who helped during harvest. He opened a drawer and put Mara's letters beside the new receipts as if both could live in the same place now. He donated a portion of the harvest to the community pantry and began a small fund that paired young people seeking work with older neighbors who needed help, a kind of mutual aid that the town had not had in years. Agnes kept her jar of salve on the shelf and wrote more notes in the recipe book. She refused to be center stage for long, but she allowed herself to be thanked in public at the autumn fair, where Pastor Miguel spoke of the dignity of care and the courage of humble hands. In small, steady ways, the farm became a place where people not only worked, but also passed on knowledge, where the old and the young taught each other how to be useful. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. When you subscribe, help keep alive stories about ordinary people who change their communities by refusing to dismiss someone. It takes a moment, but it makes a difference. Thank you for being here. To close, remember this line that Daniel said once, and said often as the harvests came in and the porch light warmed like an evening lamp. Sometimes the thing you need most is exactly what the world handed away. The town learned to see value in hands that had been labeled old, and the farmhouse learned how to hold more than one person's grief. In the months after, the legacy was not only bread on tables, but also a small workshop in the church hall and a shelf of recipes that included remedies and instructions on how to make a square meal for a tired neighbor. Daniel still had a scar, and he still missed Mara, but his days had laughter threaded through them again. The last image is Agnes sitting by the kitchen window with a cup of chamomile and the recipe book open, sunlight on her wrist, and Daniel in the yard speaking to a young man about fence repair. The end of this tale is not an end at all, but a beginning that arrived on slow feet, with a jar of salve and a hand that would not let go. Thank you for listening and for keeping these stories alive.